We all love the Python language, but it's the 200,000 plus packages that actually make Python incredibly useful and productive. But installing these packages and even installing Python itself can vary across the different platforms. In particular, Windows has had a hard time. Many of the library authors don't use Windows, and so they don't test their packages on that platform. Tutorial authors often start their tutorial steps by activating a virtual environment. That's great. That's the great first step, but it is usually source venv/bin/activate, and that doesn't work on Windows. Yet over 50% of all developers programming in Python do so on Windows. In this episode, we'll welcome back Steve Dower. He works at Microsoft and is a Python core developer. He has a bunch of statistics around Python and Windows for us. He also has tons of good news on how Python on Windows is getting much better. This is Talk Python to Me, episode 243, recorded on location at Microsoft Ignite in Orlando, Florida, November 8th, 2019. Welcome to Talk Python to Me, a weekly podcast on Python, the language, the libraries, the ecosystem, and the personalities. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Follow me on Twitter where I'm at mkennedy. Keep up with the show and listen to past episodes at talkpython.fm, and follow the show on Twitter via @talkpython. Hey everyone, Michael here. I'm excited to tell you about our latest course. Yes, we just released one a week or two ago, but here's another. This time it's a 9-hour course called Python for the .NET Developer. The idea is if you have experience with C# and .NET and would like to get better at Python, we'll take a bunch of common applications from the .NET space and recreate them in Python. For example, we'll take a data-driven web app in ASP.NET and Entity Framework and recreate that in Flask and SQL Alchemy. This means that you can take all the concepts and ideas that you know if you're a .NET developer and quickly transition to being an effective Python developer. Are you the sole Python developer at a .NET shop? Maybe your team or coworkers could quickly use their .NET background to get up to speed on Python to make it an important part of your tech stack. There's even a For My Team button. Just click that and enter the number of team members you have, and you'll probably get a discount to boot. I was also just a guest on the excellent .NET Rocks podcast with Carl Franklin and Richard Campbell. If the idea of the Python for .NET Developer course intrigues you, just visit .NETRocks.com/show=1665 to hear us discuss this from both sides of the technology fence. So check out the course at talkpython.fm/.net, DOTNET, and convert those C# skills to Python skills. Now, let's go talk with Steve. Steve, welcome back to Talk Python to Me.
Thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you here. We're recording on location here at Microsoft Ignite, so a lot of fun to do that at the conference here.
Yeah, is this your first time at Ignite?
It is my first time at Ignite.
How have you found it? I've been a couple of times, but
I am very surprised at this place, to be honest. So to me, big conferences are PyCon. Microsoft Build is a pretty big conference. This thing is like 6 times, 7 times as large as those. The scale is crazy.
This is 30,000 attendees, at least on the first day. I feel like it drops off.
I don't think there's 30,000 today.
We're on the last day. It's kind of quiet.
Yeah, it's way, way more quiet. But yeah, I actually found it really nice. I've made a lot of cool connections and met a lot of people. I've met a lot of Python people even here, run into some folks. So I'm finding it to be a cool event.
You had an interesting person come up and ask you about your laptop.
Oh, yeah. So it is the mix of the audience. It's not really a developer crowd, right? It is a developer crowd, but it's also an IT crowd. It's a SharePoint crowd. It's a DevOps crowd. It's a cloud person. There's like all these different, like all the computing IT folks brought together. So I was sitting around actually getting ready for this interview to talk with you. I was taking some notes about what we're going to talk about. And this guy comes up next to me. He's like, "Hey, that's a cool Surface book you got there. I don't think I've seen that one before." I'm like, "It's really cool, but it's a MacBook, not a Surface Surface book or Surface laptop," or whatever he called it. So yeah, it's really funny. And I think that actually it's an interesting angle to what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, it's such a different crowd here compared to the Python conferences where we'd normally hang out. I feel like I've invited you into my house for this one.
Yeah, I've come to visit you this time, not the other way around. That's right. So yeah, I think at PyCon, non-Windows computing or development is pretty common, and here, like no joke, they were mistaking my Mac for a Windows machine, and like, "Oh well, I only do C#." I'm like, "Okay, that's cool. Yeah, I know C# too, but No, I'm doing Python over here right now, things like that. And it's cool to be part of these different communities.
And it has been really exciting to see the change at Ignite over the years, and Build, in fact, because they are very different communities, but the growing Python that's showing up in them, I feel like the first or second time I was at Build and Ignite, which would have been 2014 or so, about 5 years ago, people were asking, what's Python? Why are you here? Which is,
what are you doing at our conference? Why did you invade it with your open source weirdness?
Right, exactly. It's like, what's your angle here? And they were kind of suspicious. And now it's at the point where I actually had someone come up to me yesterday and say, because I was actually here and saw everything going on, I now want to learn Python. And that, I've never heard of that happening at the Microsoft conferences before, but that's really exciting.
That's super exciting. Yeah, it is exciting. I don't know, maybe they saw some kind of machine learning presentation or something. They're like, wow, I thought this was a scripting language. Look what they're doing.
Yeah, we had a lot this year. I think 2 years ago, I was the only Python presentation at the entire conference, which was...
And there's a lot of presentations at this. That's like a very small percentage, right?
There's I don't know, we have this huge screen behind us with about 8 sessions running in parallel, and that's just this end of the rebroadcasting. There's probably 15 tracks or something crazy going on.
Yeah.
But no, this year we had 30 or so sessions about Python. And ranging a lot of machine learning, a lot of data science, a lot of app development stuff. We're covering a lot more angles now, and it's really exciting.
Yeah, it's super cool. It's not exactly what we're talking about today, but we'll talk about it at some point in the future. You gave a really interesting talk on Python security and plugging that into operating level security, right?
Yeah.
Maybe talk really quickly about some of the stuff that's coming there and what you talked about.
I kind of move from project to project that I'm working on. One of the biggest things I've been working on recently is getting auditing hooks, which was PEP 578, into CPython. So that released
in 3.8?
That released in Python 3.8.
Okay.
And now it's time for me to go around and teach everyone what you're meant to use them for. because it's they don't actually do anything on their own right now. It's just a way of raising low-level events from inside the runtime. So you'll get notifications from the socket module every time it connects to a socket, or every time a file gets opened, every time C-types gets used, all of the stuff that you really want to know is going on, but Python doesn't really give you a way to see it. And so the security applications of that are essentially logging. You want to collect all that information, and as I said in some variants of the talk, build a haystack of every single event so that when you figure out there's a needle in there, which is someone attacking your systems, then you've got a chance of figuring out what they were doing.
Right, at least you have a record of it. It's not just it's hacked into. Nobody knows why.
Right. It's I know we got hacked because people are buying our customer database off the dark web. It's
and honestly, I think a lot of customers find out they were hacked by saying, I only gave this email address to this, they do the plus thing, such and such plus, right? Site name or whatever at Gmail.
Right. Or you get one of those emails that's I know your password, and here it is. And you're like, how did they get that?
Yeah. Well, that speaks to a whole nother level of badness. I recently had to sign into a bunch of bank accounts. I'm trying to consolidate just some retirement, boring stuff, but I finally broke down and said, I have to do this. So here I go. And I tried to log into the bank. There was some workflow where I created an account and I used a 30-character randomly generated password, and then I couldn't log in again. And I kept getting an error too long sort of thing. And they were saying, well, the password has to be 16 characters or less. And, the hash of a password is always the same size, no matter how large the input. So what are they doing with that password if they care about the length of it?
I'm not going to speculate on that one, but
it's probably not good.
That may not be where you want to consolidate all of your retirement savings.
I was trying to get away from that place, so I feel all right about that. All right, so but what you were talking about with the Python stuff is there's really interesting hooks that you can plug into for compile or evaluate or execute code. There's a bunch of neat stuff that you got going on, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the really scary things that Python can do that most other tools installed on your system can't do, is you can obfuscate the command line. And so you can pass in, the example I showed was a big fat base 64 string wrapped up in a little bit of decoding and eval to dynamically essentially decrypt code and run it without anyone actually being able to see what it is. And so you don't know what it's doing until you go through and decrypt it. the sample I showed then went off and downloaded more code off the internet and decrypted that.
Yeah, because once it started, then it's trouble.
Yeah, and so being able to hook the compile event every time a bit of Python code gets execed or evaled, you see what's going on. And it's really hard. People have tried to, sandbox Python and just take those things out. And it turns out that doesn't work well. Firstly, because you need them for a variety of things in the language in the standard library. And there are other ways to work around that and to still compile code. So this way, you don't block it hard, but you get to see everything that goes through it. And then if something bad does happen, at least you know about it.
Yeah, it looks really positive. And, I don't want to talk more about it because that's not really the topic of the show. But
let's do that one later.
Yeah, we'll do that as another show. But that's what you were here talking about. And the audience was full, right? Like people were really interested in this.
Yeah, there's a lot more security-minded people here. I did run around and do a quick survey, or just a quick chat with everyone who was attending. And it was a really interesting...
What was the mix?
Diverse crowd. It was equal parts developers, security administrator, IT management. It was a pretty good spread across all the roles that would be interested in managing where and how Python is used in their setup.
Yeah, the people asking questions afterwards were like, I'm not a developer, but I have to sort of oversee the execution and protection of this stuff and so on. So help me understand how to do that with Python. That's pretty cool. All right. Now, let's talk about Python on Windows. Because it's okay, actually. Yeah?
It's okay.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah.
That's awesome. When I go to a lot of conferences, and especially I think PyCon falls under this banner, you walk in and it does feel like most people are on some kind of Mac, or maybe they're running Linux. Like there's some Windows folks there, there's some Surfaces and whatnot, but it doesn't seem to be the majority, does it?
There are more and more Surfaces, which we're very excited about, but there is always an army of glowing fruit staring back at you while you're speaking to that crowd.
That's right. They just stand out mocking you there with their little bite. Yeah, so it can feel like to a lot of Python developers, and especially I think the most relevant audience is the people building Python packages, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so it is certainly the most popular platform, that and Linux, for the people that are building the open source stuff that we know and love and rely on. And I think what's really interesting is that that's about the only data point that really looks like that. It's a bit of conference bias, I think. As we see at Ignite as well, it's biased in the other way.
Yeah.
And just through that kind of selected audience, you're going to see a certain set of people. But the problem with that, and the problem with kind of all, diversity type topics, is if that's all you see and that's what you believe reflects reality.
Right. How would you know otherwise?
Yeah, exactly.
It's not exactly the same thing, but Scott Hanselman, also from Microsoft, has a really interesting saying. He did a blog post on dark matter developers. Are you familiar with this idea?
Yeah.
It's that there's a whole bunch of folks out there who write code. They go to work. Maybe they work at some big company. They're not so passionate that they're on Twitter all the time.
Right.
They're not going to the conferences or the meetups. They just, they're happy programming. They do their job and they go home, and they're not blogging, tweeting, podcasting about it. And that world probably looks a little bit different, right? Like what those people need, but it's still, they're a really important consumer and user of programming languages.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've met quite a few of those developers through visiting like any of the big companies or financial institutes in New York. I've gotten to meet some of those guys, and it's like, they show up in a suit and then they go home and they stop thinking about coding completely for the night.
And that's fine, right? Like if that's one of those.
Oh, it sounds great. I wish I could stop thinking about coding at night.
I know, exactly. So let's talk about that. So it feels like conference reality is like, I don't know, 70% Mac, 15% Linux, 15% Windows. But then in your presentation you did at PyCon, you talked about, well, that might be what the survey around here is, but let's just look at the numbers. Right, the real numbers.
Yeah.
So what are some of the numbers?
Yeah. So I went and tracked down. There's a few data sources that everyone has access to that I went and looked at, and there's a few that I managed to speak to some people individually and get some numbers out. PyPI is a great source of who's downloading various packages, and so I pulled that one up and checked out a few packages. There's no easy way to kind of query the whole thing, and it doesn't really make sense to do that.
It doesn't make any sense to measure like PyWin32 or something like that, right?
Right. PyWin32 is doesn't get installed very often on Mac, oddly enough.
If it only badly, right?
So I tried to look at the ones that get installed everywhere, and it turned out that it was roughly, majority Linux and roughly equal Windows and Mac, which already is saying, okay, this is different from the PyCon crowd.
Yeah.
And interestingly, since then, we've done some more analysis on the PyPI data and found that there's a few packages that have long lists of dependencies that may be skewing those numbers even further.
Okay.
In favor of Linux. So there's one particular package that I won't name, but it's one of the major cloud providers' tools.
All right, so if you grab it, and then it's going to grab 20 other things, so that counts as like 20 downloads from Linux or something like that, right?
Yeah, that counts as... Well, it's going to count as a Linux download for those, and we found that particular package had a massive, massive spike on Linux for some reason. And I don't think anyone's dug into exactly why, but it's like in the tens of thousands of downloads a day, well beyond where any other reasonable package should be.
Right,
So those numbers are still skewed, but they are saying it's majority Linux, whereas a conference is not majority Linux. I had a chat with the Anaconda folks to see what they could tell me about people downloading from Conda.
Yeah, I feel like they're a little more enterprise-focused and that might have a different crowd.
They're a little more enterprise-focused
as well.
You see the percentage of Windows downloads increasing there, so it's roughly double what it is for Mac, and Linux is still about half of the overall downloads.
Okay.
The PSF survey, and we've had 2 of these now, and I believe there's one going on right now. I think.
Yeah, it'll probably be over by the time we finish. By the time we release it, so it's a little bit. I wish we could encourage people to take it, but it'll be great to look at the 2019 results. I suspect we'll see some interesting trends.
Yeah. So the interesting thing that happened with that is they changed the question slightly between the 2017 and the 2018 one. So in 2017, they didn't actually ask the question, and they looked at people's user agents to figure out which OS they were coming from.
Right.
And that one showed half of all the survey respondents were on Windows, and fewer on Mac, fewer on Linux, and then there was a big gap, which some of us speculated it's probably Android and iOS phones.
Yeah.
Because you can take the survey on whatever you're on, but half the people responding were on Windows, which means that's kind of like a max level, I feel like. But then the following year, they asked the question again. But this time they let you choose multiple responses, and they say which ones you develop for. And so the only thing that really changed between the 2 sets of data is that Windows is still 50%, and Linux went from about 10% up to 60%.
Wow.
And so
people are deving on Windows, but pushing to the cloud on Linux.
My hypothesis, and we haven't checked it, and hopefully the current survey is going to help clarify this, is people develop on Windows and deploy on Linux, or they work on Windows, deploy to Linux, and so you already have a much bigger chunk of Windows showing up there than you ever see at a conference.
How much do you think Docker influences this? Because Docker is like, I feel like it would overcount the Linux side of things, because you so often recreate these images and they reinstall,
Definitely. But virtual environments are going to be much the same thing. So I think there's a lot of repetition. But I guess virtual environments are now cached for things like PyPI, so you're not actually going to count the download again.
Yeah. But a fresh change of like a low-level part of a Docker image might as well, or CI as well, but CI is probably cached. I don't know.
Ultimately, the point that I eventually got to with all these numbers is we don't have a good answer for how many people are using this. You go and look at the editors that we also have numbers for, so VS Code, PyCharm, and they're majority Windows. Either slim or significant majority Windows, and smaller Mac, very, very little Linux. And about all we can really say is that the numbers don't line up. They definitely don't line up with what we see at a conference. And when you walk around PyCon and you come away going, literally everyone is running on a Mac, then all we can say is we know that that's not true.
Right.
So I feel like conservatively, probably half the Python community, half the Python user base is running on Windows, either for development and deployment, or just for development, then deploying to another platform.
Sure.
And that's so the other stat that I pulled out just for fun because it's a big number, but is obviously biased. So the Python.org downloads, which is mostly where Windows developers will get their Python from, and we see that in the stats. That is vast majority Windows. But the number, I ran some of the analysis for 1 month about a year ago now, and there was 20 million unique downloaders in that month. Which is
for Windows.
For Windows.
Yeah.
And most estimates of the size of the Python community, like 5 to 6 million developers. And we got 20 million downloads for Windows in that month. So
how interesting.
So we don't know the exact numbers, but I think we can say that It's certainly not a minority of the Python community. I'd estimate it's about half, maybe more.
Yeah.
And it's certainly a big number.
Yeah.
And that's about all I'm prepared to say concretely.
Yeah, sure. And so, I mean, maybe one of the takeaways from this section is we need to treat the Windows dev story importantly in the Python community, because a lot of people are doing that, and they're either having a good experience and liking Python more, or a bad experience and not feeling welcome.
Right. And so the thing that concerned me out of that is where are these developers at our conferences? Like, we have all of these Python conferences all the time, and the numbers vary, but there is nowhere near a representative number of Windows devs coming to our Python conferences, and there's also not a representative amount of kind of pain and suffering that you hear online. This is my area, so I watch the Twitter feed for Python and Windows.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of pain out there for a variety of reasons, and so I just wonder how much is people try and get started using Python on Windows and give up, or they just don't feel welcome because things are painful, and it seems like they're just not, no one's aware of them, no one sees them, no one knows they're there.
Yeah. This portion of Talk Python to Me is brought to you by Lenode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Lenode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. With 11 data centers worldwide, including their newest data center in Sydney, Australia, enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage, and the next-generation network, Lenode delivers the performance that you expect at a price that you don't. Get started on Lenode today with a $20 credit, and you get access to native SSD storage, a 40-gigabit network, industry-leading processors, their revamped cloud manager at cloud.lenode.com, root access to your server, along with their newest API and a Python CLI. Just visit talkpython.fm/Lenode when creating a new Lenode account, and you'll automatically get $20 credit for your next project. Oh, and one last thing. They're hiring. Go to lenode.com/careers to find out more. Let them know that we sent you. How many of those do you think are students?
I do have some slightly more demographic data from the Python in the Windows Store distribution. So that gives me a little bit more information. There's some age banding and some regional information. And that does certainly make it look like the majority of people installing Python on Windows are college students in the US and China primarily.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Yeah, okay. Well, and it might not be that they're developing on it. They might just need it to run something as well.
They may just need it to run, but given how new the Windows Store distribution is, it's kind of unlikely that you'll find it unless you're looking for it.
Right, okay. Yeah, so I guess the story is, here's the numbers that you're giving us.
Right.
We've got a lot of different sources, and they all seem to point at generally the same trend. Now what? What do we do about that?
Yeah, well, and so I was giving a conference talk, right? So I had to, speak to the people in the room. There's only so much value in getting up in front of a crowd of people and telling them that someone else has to do something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't like doing that. So I was like, okay, what pieces can the people here help with? Because it's no one's fault, really. It's like when a conference doesn't reflect the general population for its area, it's really hard to say whose fault that is. But it's easy. I think it's easier to say, knowing who you are, who's here are things you can do that will be net positive.
Right.
So PyCon, as we said, it's a lot of library developers, a lot of enthusiasts, it's people writing code, it's people publishing code.
People who are getting paid to do Python development already. So
exactly.
They're in a different demographic and whatnot to some degree as well, right?
Right. And so from that, I'm like, well, okay, these are the people who are potentially writing the libraries that just grate a bit on Windows. Like, for one little reason, don't work well for this Windows crowd. And maybe, contributing to that, the Python community doesn't really think about Windows. And so I built the talk around that and kind of went through some of the major kind of cross-platform mistakes or assumptions that I see people make that don't actually translate cross-platform well. Python already does a fantastic job of, hiding most of that.
Right.
And then there's some things that bleed through that can, if you're not aware of them, then you are going to make code that doesn't work well on other platforms. And the best part about it all is when I started going through those and planning out the right way to do things, turned out they're all just best practices anyway.
Right.
And they make your code better on all platforms.
Right,
more
like
reliable
don't
everywhere.
treat paths as strings. Treat them as,
Right, treat them as path objects.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, that's one of the big ones because most people are aware, Windows uses backslashes to separate path segments and POSIX uses forward slashes. And so that's kind of an immediate difference where if you've written your code using the string functions and it's all, string.split /, that doesn't split anything on Windows.
Yeah, that's a bad time. Let's start the story of like what we can do on Windows. What you say is kind of like actually just best practices for Python code anyway. But we got to get started by having Python on Windows.
Yeah.
Right? And you've done some interesting work there, right?
And the fun thing is this actually happened between two of the times I gave this talk. And so I had to go back and say, you assumed that this is true. And now you're right because I fixed it in between. So yeah.
I've fixed your assumption.
People have kind of got the hang of installing Python from the python.org installer. And one of the big differences that has from if you install it on Mac or Linux is it doesn't put Python on path by default. And
there is a checkbox, but you got to check it and you got to know that it matters.
There's a checkbox which I really don't like. Like I put that there under protest.
Okay.
And I don't like it because when you put a directory on path in Windows, it's not the same thing as putting a symlink in kind of an already shared directory. So you do that on Linux and you put it in the user's bin directory and then it just shows up and the only thing that they get access to is Python. But on Windows, when you do this, you're injecting an entire path with every single file in that directory.
All the executable stuff that's
all the
hanging out with
executables,
python.exe, right?
all the dynamic libraries. So if some other application tries to load the Python DLL, it might find the one that you put on path because that's how the resolution works on Windows.
Right. And maybe that's like version 1 of, I don't know, some C library, and they are actually looking for version 2. And of course, they're compiled against the header for version 2, so they are going to like hard crash because that's not going to line up and whatnot, right? It's a big problem.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not a fan of putting Python on path. That said, my fix for this, which I'll get to, is I'm very happy with. But it also doesn't come as like a Python 3.exe or a Python 3.7.exe. It would just be a Python, which goes against all of the instructions that are out there on how to run it.
Right. All the getting started tutorials say type Python 3 this, pip 3 that.
Yeah.
Probably source is thrown in there or dot.
Oh, yeah, source activate. Yeah. There's just all these kind of little rough differences. And the first few times I gave the talk, I pointed those out. The last time I gave the talk, I got to actually say, hey, there's a new package for this. There's a new installer for Python, which comes through the Microsoft Store. It's still released by the Python Software Foundation. Like, it's exactly the same as the one that you get from python.org. It just comes in different packaging. And the nice thing about this is this one has a more POSIX-like system for putting shortcuts on path.
Okay.
So it already comes with, it has a directory that's already on the user's path that only has essentially symlinks in it.
I see.
And so in there, I was able to put a Python 3, a Python 3, and a Python 3.7 or 3.8 shortcut that doesn't have any of the downsides of putting all the other directories on there as well. And so that now makes all of the commands available on Windows as well as Mac and Linux in exactly the same way.
Yeah, that's such a positive thing. So you can go there and you can now type Python 3 on Windows, and it means basically the same thing. You don't have to be an admin on the box to install it, right?
Right, yeah.
As long as you can get to the store, it just lives on. You probably are not even affecting other users on that Windows system, right?
No, the only impact it may have on other users is if they install Python from the store, then Windows will go, oh, I've already got this once, I'll give you the same one.
Yeah.
And it still separates everything by user, but it does save them the download.
Right. But you're not going to break one of their apps by installing it.
You can't install anything in their space, they can't install anything in yours. It's a good setup for multi-user Python.
That's super cool. Another thing that's worth pointing out is even if you don't do that, on Windows 10 now, if it's properly updated to the latest, and you type Python 3, it doesn't say Python not found or Python 3 not found, right?
Right. That was one of the big benefits of putting it in the store, is it made it really easy for the Windows team to come around and say, well, what if we just put a shortcut in there? It's like everyone's been asking for years, can you just put Python in Windows? And we figured out the best we could do without taking on a massive maintenance burden, which was we'll just put a shortcut in there. And so you run Python 3, and it'll bounce you to the store where it's then one click to actually get the Python in Python 3.
Then you type it again, then you're good.
Type it again, and you're good. And we're actually seeing literally thousands of people a day installing Python through that.
And they probably maybe didn't even know that was what they needed to do. They just wanted to run Python. They typed it and said, you don't have it, but click this button and you'll have it.
I've recommended it to a few kind of trainers and teachers, and they absolutely love it because they can now go into a classroom and say, just type Python 3 on your machine.
See, what is it? What happens?
And if it pops up with this, click install, and now type Python 3 again, and everyone in the room is ready to go.
Yeah. There's a lot of those training situations as well. Those folks don't have permission to install wide open MSIs and all sorts of stuff that will like shut down a class. Yes. You're like, okay, the first thing we got to do is install this. We can't install it. Well, this is going to be a real short presentation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, the next 2 hours are going to fly by.
Exactly. You just going to have to watch. All right. So I think we kind of started on the first thing is like, how do I run Python, right? Things are not always in the path. The path story is different. Typing Python 3 until recently used to be a problem they would run into. People would have to Google about like, well, why does Python 3 not work? How do I get Python 3? It says I have Python installed in like my installed apps, but I type Python 3 and it doesn't work. So I think people still need to be cognizant of that because even though the fix is now there, it's going to be a while before all the Windows machines live in that world, right?
Yeah, it always takes time to roll out new things. And hopefully over time, as more and more people see it, then we'll see more instructions. I'm really looking forward to people not posting new instructions every day on how to install Python the old way. Yeah. And we start seeing some more people posting how to install it the new way.
Right. Here's the store. Click it.
Yeah. And so in an effort to do that, we actually convinced some of the Microsoft documentation team to put our own how to install Python on Windows page up.
Okay.
So we'll have to double check the URL, but I think docs.microsoft.com/windows/Python will get you to some of our getting started with Python on Windows page.
That's pretty cool.
That we invested in writing up and getting good steps, and it'll take you all the way through to, you're a student, here's how to build your first game with Pygame. You're a system admin, here's how to write a script that'll do like some file scanning.
Yeah.
So we're trying to move the entire world forward rather than leaving everyone in the, here's how to install Python 3.4 instructions, which I still saw pop up recently.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I definitely am looking forward to a world where there's not a bifurcation of every step until you actually get to running your code is what you do on Mac and on Linux, is what you do on Windows, right? Like another thing that varies is pip3, right?
Yeah, so pip's always been a little bit better off because it would generate the versioned shortcuts. It's done that for quite a while. One of the downsides of the Windows Store installation is that you can only add shortcuts into that directory if you're actually the installer itself. So I have to pre-declare all of those in the package, and it means that when you pip install a package, it can't update those global shortcuts, and so they go into a directory that's not on your path. Pip these days will print a message saying you should add this to your path, and if you do that, then you'll be just fine.
Okay.
But it does mean that most kind of command line tools that you might install with pip, you won't get to through the usual name.
Right, like black or pipx or something like that?
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's always been an issue that's always kind of run into problems here and there on Python.
Yeah.
And the recommendation for a long time, for all platforms, in fact, has been to use Python 3-m and the name of that command rather than trying
Python
to use
knows where it is.
Python knows exactly where it is.
Yeah.
And the other advantage is if you know, like, that's the Python you're working with. So we generally recommend this for pip as well, because if you pip install something and then Python try and import it, and your path is messed up, and this can happen on any OS, it happens on Linux, happens on Mac, happens on Windows, then you'll go, why can't I import that package?
Right. You you type pip instead of pip3, and it accidentally goes into Python 2 because that's earlier, or something like that, right?
Yeah, and so we definitely recommend, Python 3-m pip, even for pip.
Yeah, Brett Cannon just wrote a big article about that, talking about how we recommend Python 3-m.
Yeah.
And for all the different things. This portion of Talk Python to Me is brought to you by brilliant.org. Let me knock something off your holiday to-do list. Gifts. Spread the love to your loved ones by gifting them Brilliant. This really excites me because it's such a fun way to nurture curiosity, build confidence, and develop problem-solving skills crucial to school, job interviews, or to their career. Brilliant's thought-provoking content breaks up the complexities into bite-sized, understandable chunks that will lead them from curiosity to mastery. Go to talkpython.fm/brilliant and grab a gift subscription to help your loved ones finish their day a little smarter this season. That's talkpython.fm/brilliant, or just click the link in the show notes.
I'll call out some false assumptions that you had that people often make about writing code. So we touched on this first one a little bit, like everyone uses / for paths.
Yeah, I see this assumption pop up a lot, and it normally looks like, using the string functions, so string.split, .partition, and just passing in a /. That works fine as long as, every platform you're on is using /, but there's plenty that don't.
I use the built-in pathlib or os.path style to process that, even if I know it's only going to run on a POSIX system, because I don't want to have to deal with thinking about that, right?
Yeah.
As a string.
There's a lot of... Python has about 5 different ways you can do this, but certainly the os.path module is very useful. And the nice thing about that is you can also import POSIX path directly or NT path directly
Okay.
if you know you need cross-platform behavior, if you like specific platform behavior.
Okay.
And so
yeah, very cool, yeah.
I've definitely written code that uses os.path for some things and POSIX path for other things, because that's, it's going to look more like a URL, or it's going to be sent to a different system. So you have that option there. But really, we have pathlib now, and we've had pathlib since, I think, Python 3.4,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just so much nicer.
Yeah, pathlib's really nice, and yeah, but definitely not strings, right?
Definitely not strings.
Okay, because I guess the tie back to Windows is right. Like, it will break on Windows. You should do it anytime, but it will actually break, not just be less convenient.
It will break because if you get a Windows path, and so the thing that Windows makes a little more complicated here is if you give Windows a path that has /, it will go through and correct it for you most of the time.
Yeah.
Not all the time, but most of the time it'll correct / to /. But any path that it gives you, or any path that a user gives you, is going to have / in it. And you can't split on / then.
Yeah. It won't
because
work.
you'll always get one element back, and that's probably not what you wanted.
No, that's not good. Also, root paths are kind of funny, right? Like, it could be weird maps or volumes or other stuff, right?
Yeah,
not just C:/.
It gets very interesting, the kind of range of shortcuts for identifying a drive or a mount point. So there's the kind of internal system representation, which for a drive often looks like a GUID, like it's a globally unique identifier, and no one's typing those. So we have a shortcut that's going to be like C:/ or D:. There's SMB shares, which are, // computer name, / and say, which part of this is the root of the drive? It's like if I'm dotting up the directory, how far do I go before I have to stop? Because it varies and it's different. And the Python libraries know how to handle that. We've built that logic in.
Yeah, so just don't use strings for paths.
Don't use strings for path.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Use pathlib.
Speaking of paths, tilde / is always good. That gets me home, right? There's no place like /.
There's no place like /. People love putting their configuration files in /.
Yeah.
And Windows doesn't have tilde. Like, tilde is just a path character. You can put that anywhere you want, and it's just another part of the name.
That lives in the working directory.
Right. That lives exactly where you are right now.
Yeah.
Home is where your heart is, not where you want to be. But people do make they do very quickly figure out, I should be using the user profile environment variable, or figure out the home directory some other way to do that. But even that, depending on what you're planning to use it for, doesn't necessarily line up. Like, you see /, dot and something for a lot of configuration files on Linux. But on Windows, that just gets thrown into the root of the user's directory, which actually has a set of subdirectories for different purposes. And you start digging down, particularly for
app data, local app data roaming, all that kind of stuff.
And they all have different reasons and different behaviors. Like, app data roaming will actually propagate between different machines on a network if that's configured for that. So anything you put there is going to be copied or may be copied onto a network share and automatically copied down if the user logs in somewhere else, which is really handy. But if you're using it for 10 gigabytes worth of log files, then everyone's going to be real upset about saturating the network and login taking so long.
Yeah, exactly. The domain controller is out of disk space. We don't know why, or wherever it gets stored.
But the other thing is, that's a very hidden directory to users. Like, it's about as hidden as, a dot file.
Yeah.
But if you're creating something that you want the user to see and modify, then they have a documents folder for that. And you probably want a subdirectory in that documents folder anyway, just for organizational purposes. And so you start looking at a very different layout from where you would keep all of this stuff on a POSIX-based system.
It makes me crazy when every program thinks its projects folder needs to live in the root of my user directory. Like, yeah, doesn't need to be topmost. Come on.
It doesn't need to be, and that doesn't even help on Windows because it's such a pain to get there.
Yeah.
Because all of the shortcuts go deeper. It's like documents is really easy to get to. Pictures is really easy to get to. Videos is real. That random folder you created is very hard to get to if you don't know
use the address bar of the file stuff. Yeah, for sure. So the fix for all the path problems were to use some of the built-in path libraries. What's the fix for this?
So this one, the recommendation I have is to use AppDirs, which is a module made for this purpose. It's slightly opinionated, so you will see, good programs not behaving exactly like it does, but it's a very simple module. It's a single file, so you may even just copy it into your project and keep it around. But it lets you query for a specific kind of purpose. And so you can say, give me the user's data directory, give me the user's configuration directory, give me a cache directory.
Give me the documents directory.
Yeah, I believe it will give you the documents directory. I think that may be one of the ones that's missing.
Okay, well, you could obviously get the home directory and add documents.
And that's exactly, and that one's not too difficult to add in if you find yourself needing that. But it does it cross-platform. So you import the module and you query for a directory, and it will pick, depending on what platform you're on, and give you a sensible layout that's not going to surprise, not going to upset anyone who's using it.
Yeah, that's great. Strings are also interesting.
Well, yeah. Unicode is the interesting thing.
Yes.
I had this section of my talk got better and better every time I gave it because people came and gave me more context and more information.
Yeah, all right.
But let me pose you a trivia question here. Which was invented first, or which was released first? Windows 1.0 or the Unicode standard?
I would initially guess Unicode, but I'm thinking this might not be right.
You'd think so. Unicode's been around for a long time, but
stuff in quotes, it doesn't seem like that's totally new. It seems like that should have been right at the beginning.
It should have been. Unfortunately not. Windows came out first.
There were no emojis.
Which means
that's the problem.
They were not, no one wanted emojis at that point yet. But because Windows came out first, they had to handle internationalization without Unicode, and which is why the code page system is there. And there were previous systems that were already using it. So this well predates Unicode regardless. But it was released in Windows, and about 6 years before Unicode even came out, it was released in Windows. Which means that, you have this very ingrained system of code pages and 8-bit character encodings that now you have a compatibility burden. Yeah. And so when Unicode did come out, then it just wasn't possible to go back and say, well, forget all of that, we're going to switch to Unicode.
Because so much of it was at the C level where you pass char pointers.
Yeah.
The char pointers are the wrong size for Unicode.
And so, trivia question number 2. Which came first, UTF-8 or UTF-16?
You start with a smaller one, right?
You start with the smaller, yeah.
UTF-8?
Afraid not. UTF-16, in fact, UCS-2. So the 2-byte character encoding was the first one.
Yeah.
And turns out Windows did actually go, oh, we should adopt this because this is now the standard. And that's why the Unicode encoding is 2 bytes throughout Windows, because that was the official standard at the time Windows said, oh, hey, let's do this. And then UTF-8 came, it was proposed like 4 or 5 years later. And eventually, and now that's the standard. And I have no doubt that if Windows kind of restarted,
it would just be pure UTF-8.
It would just be pure UTF-8. Absolutely. You do get some bloat on a number of languages and a number of very important languages to Windows. So arguably there's a kind of equalization of kind of memory wastage for certain character sets. Mm-hmm. If you're in English, then UTF-8 is vastly more efficient. But as soon as you get into kind of many of the Asian languages and some of the European languages, the 16-bit...
It takes more bytes to actually do the UTF-8 stuff?
You end up with every single character taking 4 or 5 UTF-8 bytes.
Okay.
And
that can be a lot.
Whereas it would only be 1, or in some cases 2 UTF-16 words.
Yeah.
Which, averages out to be smaller. So maybe there's a case for either of those, but just for historical reasons, Windows has ended up with UTF-16 as kind of the default choice of Unicode, and there's no real way to go back and undo that at this point without massively disrupting the entire ecosystem.
No one's rewriting Windows with breaking changes that big.
Yeah. And so what that leads to, as far as Python's concerned, is a kind of fundamental difference in how paths get passed around as strings. Because on POSIX, it's bytes. And the lowest level, it's bytes. And when it comes into Python, then you can keep it as bytes and pass it back out as bytes and kind of make sure that nothing changes and gets disrupted in the way there. And Windows has the APIs for that, but it's doing a silent conversion in the background through the old legacy code page system, which can lose data. It can absolutely lose data, and it seems semi-random. This was a big Python 2 problem, was it would do this, and so you get...
This is one of the major breaking changes from 2 to 3, honestly, right? Like in terms of the effect that it had.
In terms of the effect, but it's also one of the most positive ones, because I heard from many students in particular who logged into Windows with their name, and their name is Chinese characters or Korean characters, or it's a language that Python 2 could not support. And sometimes they do it on machines where the code page, so the legacy support for Windows, can't handle it either.
I can't even say my name.
That's
crazy.
They couldn't
even feel good.
Print their own. It made them feel terrible.
Yeah.
So the break for that for Python 3 was painful. But then
was needed.
But then you have a handful of other libraries that still use bytes for paths because it's more performant in their context. But it's also going to break these people again, even on Python 3, if you're forcing all the file system stuff to go through this arbitrary encoding. And so the preferred one is to just use string on Windows.
Right.
Where
yes, str works great.
Yes, str instead of bytes.
Yeah.
And in fact, it works fine on POSIX as well. We implemented on that side the conversion for file system stuff to perfectly round trip. So even if there's characters in paths that, if you converted to text would be corrupt and it would throw exceptions, we actually preserve those and they'll pass back in. So there's a little bit of a performance impact, but
it'd be better to be slow and right than fast and wrong.
Absolutely.
Nice. And that's a super easy fix, just like use string.
Well, it's never quite as easy as just use string, but where it gets really interesting is if you're doing things like reading in a list of files of the file system and writing it out to another file, because you're in control of that encoding. So Python has not and probably will not change the default encoding of a file.
Mm-hmm.
Where you open a file to write text to it.
What is the default encoding?
The default is the system locale typically.
Okay.
Which for most non-Windows users these days is UTF-8.
Yeah.
And for every Windows user is whatever the legacy encoding is. And this is a backwards compatibility thing. We would love to change it to be UTF-8 by default, but now you can't read in the file that you wrote with the previous version of Python. And
it's tricky.
That's just
that's a hard sell.
It's very disruptive.
Very disruptive and concerning. Like, what do you mean my file is corrupted?
Yeah.
Yeah, that won't feel good.
Yeah, and so even opening a file to write to, if you want it in UTF-8, then you should just specify that.
Yeah, I always put UTF-8. I wasn't sure what I get if I don't put that though.
Yeah, you will get. It's not entirely random.
Yeah, but it's not entirely the same always.
It's not a complete encoding.
Okay.
So there will be characters that can't be written out in that.
All right. Well, let's maybe round this out with one more false assumption here. We're sitting here looking at my very fancy Surface Book Pro. No, I mean MacBook Pro, and I'm a library developer, and maybe I can't test on Windows. I'm sympathetic. Yeah, like half of my users are Windows developers, but I can't verify whether my library works or not.
Yeah, and I get this one. It's very easy it's not very easy to get a Windows setup necessarily. That it's very hard to switch kind of the platform you're used to another one just for the sake of being able to address all of your users. But at the same time, that's like kind of drawing the line too close. And it's like, I'm aware of a problem and I'm aware that I need to solve it. And I think of one solution and that's too hard. And so I stop thinking about it.
Yeah, that's hard. So
that's kind of what I see happen occasionally here. And it just, it makes me, just choke up a little bit because I'm like, it's just bad and lazy.
Yeah,
and
it's so close.
And we have so many better options these days.
And it's really saying thanks, but you're not welcome here to like half the users.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I could get it 10 years ago because 10 years ago, we didn't have GitHub. Or if we did have GitHub, we didn't have the reach of GitHub like we do now.
Right. Or Azure Pipelines or all the CI systems.
Azure Pipelines, GitHub Actions. We didn't have all of these things where you can either set up to do it automatically and not need to own the machine yourself. And we didn't have the reach to be able to say, hey, I need help with this. Can someone come and help me test on Windows? Because that's how it always happened, essentially.
Honestly, I think the hardest one if it's not you, the hardest one to test for is Mac.
Yeah.
Right? Because
I test none of my stuff on Mac. That's not quite true, but I do it all through CI.
Yeah, exactly. But it's tougher to get CI for Mac.
It is.
Yeah,
it is.
But Windows and Linux are pretty easy to get.
They're pretty easy. And Azure Pipelines and GitHub Actions both have Windows, Mac, and Linux. And I think at this point they have multiple choices for all of those.
Okay,
so you can
do like Mojave versus Catalina. I think Windows 7 versus 10 or something.
I don't think we're offering Windows 7 as an option on any of those.
You don't want to encourage that.
The builds actually run on Windows Server, not even Windows Client. So you do get a choice between Windows Server 2016 and 2019, and a choice of like the Visual Studio version, which is primarily, people should just be on the latest for the most part. Python stuff is not that involved in the build tool set to really need to, I must stay on the old one anymore. We made sure that Python works with future builds as well, so you can build for old versions of Python with newer tools now.
Yeah, so that's cool.
So the options and the opportunities there is really good, and they're all free. Like, it doesn't cost anything to just put on your page, I'm looking for someone to help with Windows maintenance, and it doesn't cost anything for an open source project to be on GitHub Actions.
Right, and people are probably excited if they're working on Windows. They're like, oh, this is a really easy way for me to contribute to this project.
Yeah.
Right? Like, all I got to do is sort of like run the test and just try a few things out. And
You'll get more contributors because you're not telling them, you have to switch to Linux to contribute to my project because you've got the CI running on Linux as well.
Right.
So it opens up your pool of contributors, and it helps with releases. One of the biggest problems we see every time we release an update to Python, so Python 3.8 came out, and we're seeing this happen a bit, is packages don't have wheels ready. They don't have builds. They're not actually ready for Python 3.8. And once you've got a CI setup going,
it's almost automatic, yeah?
It's almost automatic. As soon as the CI service has that version of Python on there or has a way to get it sooner, and we're working on making that happen faster, then it's very easy to just spin another build and release that, and all of your users are now successful at installing your package.
Good advice. So that pretty much wraps it up. You want to give us the quick summary?
The quick summary,
the checklist? You had a checklist. You don't have to remember all this. Here's the checklist of what you got to do.
Yeah, it annoys me when I see people holding their phones up at me while I'm speaking, because all of my slides build up.
Yeah.
And so there'll be stuff on the slide that's bad, and a big red line is about to appear through it, and someone's already taking a photo.
They're going to share it on social media now.
And I'm like, no, wait until it gets crossed out. Yeah, so I told everyone to wait for the checklist at the end of the talk, because I did want to make this really actionable and really easy for people to follow up. So the things that I would recommend you check just before the next release of your project, anytime you feel like it, does the -m option work on it? So if you've got a script entry point, can you also start your project running by typing Python 3 -m, name of your project, and document it? Tell your users this is how you can use it.
Yeah.
Are you manipulating paths by hand anywhere? Like, do you have any .split instead of os.path.split or pathlib objects?
I like this recommendation because it's just like you should do the thing that's easier and safer, and you'll be in good shape.
Yeah. Do I put configuration in weird places, which, arbitrary paths for storing stuff? It can make a mess, but it can, you can lose information and make things a little harder to find. Are you still using bytes for strings? If you've gotten out of Python 2 and into Python 3, then there's no need to do that anymore. That was the problem that we were trying to move people off. So feel free to stop. Just use the string type. The string type is very optimized for what it does. And do you have, continuous integration tools or collaborators on your project? Like, if it's just you on the project, and the problem is that you are not representative of your entire audience. No one person
no
can
matter
be.
Who you are or what you do. Yeah.
No matter who you are, there are people out there who are using your code who are doing things differently from you. And with continuous integration tools, GitHub Actions, Azure Pipelines, you can kind of have automated systems that look like more of your users, but just welcoming more people in to contribute and collaborate. Even if it's just, hey, I'll email you when I'm about to do a release. Can you run, your tests on it? And a lot more people are willing to do that than you think.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's all good advice, and I definitely think the stats that you laid out are pretty interesting. So
thanks. Yeah.
It's not the world we often see around us, but it's the world as it is. At least as good as the stats can measure from what we're using now. Cool. All right. Well, before we wrap up the show, let me ask you the final two questions. If you're going to write some Python code, what editor do you use?
I'm bouncing between editors all the time right now.
What's in the orbit that you're hitting?
I use Visual Studio until it annoys me, then I use Visual Studio Code until it annoys me, then I use Notepad 2 until it annoys me, then I go back to Visual Studio, and That's my code.
That's the three-body problem, the three-editor problem.
The three-editor problem.
Yeah, indeed. And then notable PyPI package.
Oh,
what have you come across lately that's like, oh, this is pretty amazing?
Oh, I forgot this question was going to be here, so I hadn't thought about it.
Yeah, and see, this is like
on the spot. On the spot. What was I? I was playing with something the other day that I really enjoyed.
While you're here thinking, I'll tell you about one that I found recently that I thought was kind of cool. Is HTTPX.
Oh, yes. Okay, I do like that one.
I like it because it's request compatible, but it also does HTTP2 and async, and then there's also some like intermediate, like simpler async parallelism built in. It's a cool one.
I've been helping promote that one. It's in its early stages. Like they're looking for contributors who are interested in the next big HTTP project. So I'm excited about that one. I guess I can't claim it.
Yeah, you claim it. Go ahead.
I can claim it? Okay.
You claim it.
We both like HTTPX.
It's a good one. Yeah, it is early days and it could use some help, but I like it as well. I think it's got promise. Cool. All right. Well, Steve, final call to action. People are working their packages or working on their non-Windows machines. What can they do to welcome the Windows people?
I think it's literally just that. Like, welcome the Windows people. You know, I gave a few simple things you can do to make them feel welcome, but it really just is. This also works on Windows, or if it doesn't, we want it to. You know, please help.
Yeah, they got the checklist.
Yep.
All right, well, thanks for being here.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
This has been another episode of Talk Python to Me. Our guest on this episode was Steve Dower, and it's been brought to you by Lenode and brilliant.org. Start your next Python project on Lenode's state-of-the-art cloud service. Just visit talkpython.fm/Lenode, Linode. You'll automatically get a $20 credit when you create a new account. Brilliant.org encourages you to give the gift of critical thought and knowledge. Visit talkpython.fm/Brilliant and grab a gift subscription to help your loved ones finish their day a little smarter this season. Want to level up your Python? If you're just getting started, try my Python Jumpstart by Building 10 Apps course. Or if you're looking for something more advanced, check out our new async course that digs into all the different types of async programming you can do in Python. And of course, if you're interested in more than one of these, be sure to check out our Everything Bundle. It's like a subscription that never expires. Be sure to subscribe to the show. Open your favorite podcatcher and search for Python. We should be right at the top. You can also find the iTunes feed at /iTunes, the Google Play feed at /Play, and the direct RSS feed at /RSS on talkpython.fm. This is your host, Michael Kennedy. Thanks so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Now get out there and write some Python code.